Hello, good evening, and welcome to the third virtual New Sheridan Club meeting since the lockdown. I hope you're all bearing up. If we were in the Wheat Chief at this point, normally Torquil would shuffle onto the stage and make some announcements about forthcoming events. Sadly, Torquil isn't here, and there aren't any events anyway, so I'm going to push straight on with today's talk. Bollocks. Yes? Yeah. That's just a time lag. Sorry about that, people. Ali was suddenly panicking that there was no picture, forgetting about the delay. We started selling Absinthe at the Candlelight Club a few years ago, and I've been interested in it for a while, but I was struck when customers started seeing it, the interesting variety of responses and misconceptions in some cases. So that's why I decided to do this, just to see if we can delve the mysteries of absinthe and perhaps puncture some of the myths. Now, if we were all here together in the Wheat Chief, I'd probably start off by asking around the room what you knew about absinthe. I'm assuming you've all heard of it. Since you're not here, I'm just going to play your role myself. So what do we know about absinthe? Well, first of all, it's green. Yes, it is green most of the time, except when it's not. Some absinthes are actually colourless. And some people will tell you that colourless absinthe was invented in Switzerland after it was banned there, so that clandestine distillers making moonshine absinthe could do it more surreptitiously without it being spotted. Frankly, anyone who's ever been in the same room as a glass of absinthe, as we are right here now, will tell you that you smell it long before you see it. In fact, colourless absinthe dates long back before the ban. And in France, it's known as Blanche, and in Switzerland as La Bleue. What else do we know about absinthe? Well, you say, it drives you mad. Does it? Certainly, some people say that, and there was a time when a lot of people were powerfully lobbying that this was the case. I've drunk plenty of absinthe, and I'm just the same as I was before I started. You know, perhaps not that much of a yardstick. But I can reassure you that any absinthe you're likely to encounter today is no more harmful for you than any other alcohol that's about 70% strong. So you can rest assured there. But it's not to say that it's not the same as other alcohols. It's long considered to have a particular quality of its own, but it won't drive you mad. So what else do we know? It's drunk by arty people. Well, it certainly was. There's absolutely no doubt that it was very popular with people like Oscar Wilde, Toulouse-Lautrec, Ernest Dowson, who seemed to have consumed little else. And we know this because of everything that they wrote about it. Does it make you a better artist? Some of the literature suggests that they believe it was. In fact, towards the end, it became a bit of a running joke. There was somebody joking about a particular artist, and they said, sadly, he needs about 7 glasses of absinthe to crack that sonnet, but he never has enough money for more than 6. So it was certainly something that was considered at the time. Does it really make you a better artist? Well, we're having a scientific experiment today to find out. I've sent samples of absinthe to 15 volunteers amongst the New Sheridan Club, and the idea was that they would produce some sort of artwork before this meeting, whilst not under the influence of absinthe, which they've posted to the Facebook event page, so you can have a look at them there. During this meeting, they should consume their absinthe, and then while still under the influence, produce a second artwork, and post that, and then we'll all be able to see for ourselves, completely scientifically, whether after consuming the absinthe they were better artists, whether it somehow unlocked their creativity. So we'll be able to find out. What else do we know about absinthe? Well, obviously, it's illegal. It's not illegal. It was banned at the beginning of the 20th century in most of Europe and in America. It was never banned here, mainly because I don't think it was popular enough for it to be considered a problem. But after it was banned in France and Switzerland, which is where they made it, basically you couldn't get hold of it here anymore, and people just stopped thinking about it. And in time, people came to think that it had been banned here as well, but it wasn't. Also never banned in Spain and a few other places as well. Moreover, nowadays it is legal, and we'll come to the wheres and whys force of that later on, but you can rest assured it is legal. I certainly had people in the Candlelight Club convinced that it was illegal, but it's not. Okay.
Could you just ask if everyone's okay for sound?
Is everyone okay for sound? Ali has asked me to ask. So, whilst we're waiting for those replies, let's talk about what absinthe actually is. Absinthe is a spirit, an alcoholic drink. It's about, the green ones are roughly between 65-72% alcohol. The white ones tend to be about 55. You make it by starting off with a ready-made base spirit. It could be made from grain or grapes or sugar beet or anything. And in that you infuse your botanicals, a collection of herbs, spices, and then you redistill it, which is to say you heat it until the alcohol evaporates, rises off as a vapor, taking with it some of the flavors that it's got from those botanicals, goes through a pipe, you cool it, distill it back into a liquid again. Now, so far, it's been made much the same way as gin. Obviously, gin tastes different because it's got different botanicals in it, but the process is the same. However, with absinthe, certainly with green absinthe, some of those botanicals, the flavors that you want, can't be kept through that distillation process. And those ones are added to the liquor after distillation. I think I'm right in saying that hyssop, it's a common ingredient in absinthe, and I believe that's one of the ones where the flavour that you want won't pass through distillation. It's not that uncommon. To give you an idea, cucumber nowadays is quite a popular botanical in gin, but famously you can't boil it up with the other things and then carry its flavour. So any gin that you come across that's got cucumber in it, that's been added afterwards. Famously Hendrick's, for example. Hendrick's cucumber flavour comes from a concentrated syrup that they buy in and add afterwards. I've tasted it. It's quite nice, actually, if you can imagine what a really intense cucumber tastes like. And so it is with absinthe. And that is why absinthe is green, because the chlorophyll from those herbs added after the distillation leaves its colour behind. Now, in this slide I've got up here now, there's green and there's green. Now, absinthe that's been coloured naturally is a bit like that sample on the right. It tends to be a sort of olivey green. In time, it will maybe go more browny and fade a bit. The one on the left, that's artificially coloured. And in fact, both of these samples are a brand called Lafay, which we'll be hearing more about later on. There came a point about 7 years ago when the guy who makes it, reformulated it. The original version, artificially coloured, and the new version, he found a way to his satisfaction to colour it naturally. And that shows you the difference in colours, which is useful if you're shopping for absinthe. If you see an absinthe that has more of a sort of bluey green to it, it's artificially coloured. Likewise, the colour of natural absinthe is quite fragile. Have a look at this. The absinthe on the left is from the batch that I sent out to our guinea pigs. It's Lafay absinthe, so it's the reformulated one, naturally coloured. So they claim. I'm trust that it is. He sells it in a, green absinthe will almost always be in a very dark bottle, and his bottle is actually completely opaque. And when I was pouring out the samples, I had some calls to open the original bottle of the reformulated stuff, which I got in 2013. Yeah, I don't drink a lot of absinthe in practice. I've still got that bottle. And that's the one on the right. And it's been in a completely opaque bottle for the last 7 years, whatever. But even so, the colour has faded away. And I left those two samples out overnight, and in the morning they were both completely colourless. So, yes, the colour of natural absinthe is a fragile thing. So, what are these botanicals that go into it? Anyone who's ever tasted absinthe will know that the primary flavour you're getting off it is aniseed. But there's quite a lot of ingredients that go into a lot of absinthe, and the defining ingredient is actually wormwood. This is Artemisia absinthium, grand wormwood as it's known. And this is the thing that makes absinthe. Absinthe is the presence of wormwood. Wormwood actually turns up in other things as well. Famously, vermouth always has wormwood in it. In fact, the name vermouth comes from the German Wermut, which means wormwood. It's called wormwood. It's long considered to have medicinal properties. Its name comes from the fact that it was considered to cure intestinal worms, and it's been used for thousands of years to settle stomachs and sharpen the appetite. And I think it's pretty likely that absinthe was born as an attempt to bottle and preserve the medicinal values of it. Other typical botanicals in absinthe, obviously anise, both star anise, green anise, fennel, kind of along the same lines, lemon balm, hyssop I mentioned. And some of them can have an awful lot of ingredients. And because you've got these different stages of adding things, it's quite a complicated process, which is one of the reasons why absinthe is quite expensive. Another reason is that because the alcohol level is so high, the duty is very high. Now, one of the things that wormwood is famous for is being incredibly bitter. And it's like in literature, it's like a byword for bitterness. And wormwood's been used as a bittering agent, in things like beer. There was a drink called Pearl, which was like a sort of mulled beer infused with wormwood, quite popular in Victorian times as a sort of morning drink with labourers. So you're probably thinking, well, so absinthe is a really bitter drink, right? And in fact, no. Proper absinthe is not really any more bitter than, say, coffee, if that. And the reason for that is that the molecules that make things bitter don't really pass through distillation. I'm reliably informed by distiller friends of mine. And I'm showing you this because this, as an aside, is actually the place where a gin called Sacred is made by a guy called Ian Hart. And he does literally make it in his kitchen. He uses a vacuum pump. So instead of making the alcohol evaporate by applying heat, he makes it evaporate by reducing the pressure inside with this pump that sits in a shed in his garden. And he distills each of the botanicals individually and then blends them afterwards. As such, he's always playing around with different botanicals. And I was around there once, and he gave me samples of 3 infusions. So this is the stage where you infuse the botanical in spirit of hops, gentian, and wormwood. And they were incredibly bitter. These are murky brown things, really bitter to taste. Then he gave me samples of the distillates that he'd made from the same infusion. So he'd evaporated them, condensed them down. Completely different. Not a hint of bitterness to any of them. What you actually get is quite different flavours. And in a way, this is kind of the point of redistilling things, is that you can kind of get the pleasanter flavours out of things. So my point is that absinthe, proper absinthe, isn't actually better, even though wormwood famously is. So that's what absinthe is, and I'm going to jump to how do you consume it, mainly for the benefit of people who are sitting at home looking at their sample bottles thinking, what do I do with this? There are plenty of cocktails that have absinthe in them. I'm not going to dwell on that too much right now. But some famous ones like the Sazerac, Corpse Survivor No. 2, and others. But the main way that absinthe is traditionally drunk is just with water. Do not try and drink absinthe neat. It's not intended to be drunk that way. Think of it as a concentrate, like a cordial or something. The reason, don't drink it neat because it's very strong for a start, and the reason it has to be that strong is that it keeps the colour stable. We were saying how fragile it is. And it keeps it's quite powerful, pungent stuff, and there are a lot of essential oils dissolved in that alcohol, which it needs. So don't be tempted to drink it neat. It's traditionally drunk with water, and it's a photograph of me with some absinthe with water in it. As you can see, it's gone cloudy. That clouding is known as the louche. It's called louching. You may have seen a similar effect when you add water to Pernod or pastis of any kind. Pernod is basically what the Pernod company switched to making when they couldn't make absinthe anymore. So it's kind of like absinthe without the wormwood in it. Basically what happens is that as you add water, you're reducing the alcohol level to the point where it's no longer alcoholic enough to keep all those essential oils in solution, and they come out and they form an emulsion, a little suspension of fat droplets, which has this opaque, cloudy colour. And in fact, aficionados of absinthe will rate the quality of the louche. And with some absinthe, it has almost a sort of opalescent quality to it, which you can kind of almost see in that photograph. I think it's kind of part of the mystique of absinthe and part of the things that people appreciate about the experience. How much water do you add? Well, if you look at the back of a bottle, it'll often say add 3 parts, 4 parts, 5, 6, maybe even 8 parts water to 1 part absinthe. I think that's a bit watery. Obviously, it depends on taste, but don't forget, once you've added too much water, you can't take it out again. I did some judging for the Spirits Business magazine of absinthe, and we actually settled on a ratio of 2.5 to 1, 2.5 water to 1, which I think is pretty good. You know, if you find that a bit intense, you can still add more. The thing is that if you try drinking it neat, for example, you would probably taste less of it because it's too concentrated. As you add water to things, certain aromas come up. You probably notice that malt whiskey drinkers often add a little bit of water to it because it releases certain flavours and aromas. So there's kind of a sweet spot there, which might be different for everyone. There's a distiller called Ted Bro, whom we'll hear more about later on. He gave me a handy tip once about how to find that sweet spot. This is some photographs I took a while ago. That's the same sample of absinthe in a shot glass, taken 5 photographs as I added water to it. So initially it's dark green, looks darker than it is because it's against a red backdrop. Second photo, starting to add water, you can see it's starting to go cloudy, and the cloudiness is at the bottom. Third, you can see that more closely. And as you add water and it gets more cloudy, the cloudiness rises up from the bottom. And in the fourth picture, you can see there's just a little bit left at the top. That dark green transparent layer is known as the hydrophobic layer. And in the 5th sample, you can see you've just added enough water where that layer has finally vanished. And Ted says that's the best point to drink it, either at the point where that layer just disappears or just before. And I tried this, and I think it works. So that's something worth trying. So traditionally, you may well have heard about the absinthe ritual. And there's certainly a lot of ritual surrounded the preparation and consumption of absinthe. And the traditional way involves an absinthe fountain. I don't have one here to show you. The Candlelight Club does own one, but I think it's in a lock-up in Kent at the moment. We've got through quite a few over the years, as they're quite fragile, and we even tried gaffer taping them to the bar top, and they still get knocked off. So I'm going to show you a picture. That's a fairly simple one. That's one of the ones that we had. An absinthe fountain doesn't dispense absinthe; it dispenses water. And what you do is you'll start off with a glass of absinthe. There's no absinthe in that one. And you'll get one of these. It's called an absinthe spoon. Unlike most spoons, it's flat and it has holes in it, so it's not much use for regular spoon duties. But you would place it across the top of your glass like that, and you would place a sugar lump on top like that. And then you would place this underneath one of the little spigots. And that central section is filled with iced water. And you would open that spigot so there's just a trickle or just a drip of water coming out. And you would allow that water to fall onto the sugar cube. And as it drips through, it's diluting your drink, but it's also gradually dissolving the sugar lump. Now, of course, you may not necessarily want to sweeten your absinthe, but this is kind of a tradition. You'll notice the absinthe fountain has 2 spigots. Here's a more fancy one. This is an American brand called Lucid. You notice the glass on the right. You'll see there's a sort of swelling or bulb at the bottom. That's quite common in traditional absinthe glasses. This one doesn't have it. The idea was that demarcated the amount of glass that you put your absinthe in, known as the dose. It's the term which probably doesn't really help with its image as a drug. And then the rest of the glass was for water, so you drip that through. Here's another one. This one has 4 spouts. I've seen some with 6 and maybe even 8. Obviously, preparing absinthe this way takes a bit of time because you've got to wait for it to come through. And if you're in a busy cafe, you might want to be preparing more than one at a time. You might want to have one of these in the center of a table so that people can all prepare their drinks at the same time in a companionable manner. So you might well ask yourself, why do it like this? Well, first of all, assume you do want to put sugar in your absinthe. A sugar lump like that, if you put it into a cup of hot tea, it'll dissolve pretty immediately, as we all know. You try stirring sugar lump like that into an ice-cold glass of absinthe, and it's very tough. It doesn't dissolve. So doing it this way is actually a pretty good way of making sure the sugar does dissolve. You just get sludge of crystals at the bottom of your glass. Another reason for doing it this way is that, as we already discussed, some people are very particular about hitting the sweet spot with dilution. So by doing it slowly, you can see when it's exactly at the right point. And as I say, there's a lot of ritual associated with absinthe, and you might want to do it slowly this way so that you've got time to contemplate the mysteries of absinthe. But I should point out that it's not absolutely necessary. At the end of the day, you're just adding water to it. And in fact, you'll see in this picture, this is a poster from the time. He is using the spoon and the sugar, but he's just pouring the water from a carafe over the top. He's also being distracted by a dame outside, so he's not really looking at what he's doing. Notice it says, "C'est ma santé." Whatever you might think about the horrors of absinthe, when it was being marketed earlier on, it was a health drink. People drank it for their health. You see it says oxygéné. There was actually somebody who tried to find a way of oxygenating it to make it more hygienic and more healthy. I think that was kind of late on when they saw that the writing was on the wall. This chap here, he's just pouring water from an earthenware jug. So even back then, not everybody used all this fancy equipment. This guy here, again, being distracted by a lady, and while his street urchin is stealing his absinthe. But you can see that he was in the process of simply pouring water into it from a jug. This one here, again, you can see they've got just a carafe. Anyway, you'll notice that these are posters advertising absinthe, and they were obviously quite happy with and keen to associate it with lewdness and wicked behaviour. The picture I used as a sort of thumbnail for this talk of a gentleman in a top hat. I didn't notice it at first, but what's quite interesting is that the girl's drinking absinthe, but in front of her she's got a glass of something else, probably ratafia or something like that. It's his absinthe, so she didn't order it, he did, but he's persuading her to have a drink. So it's a bit more sinister than it at first appears. So the point being that you don't necessarily need an absinthe fountain to do it. This lady here is using an absinthe spoon and sugar, but she's obviously getting the water from a leaky gutter or something. So the world's your lobster. Also, look at this. This is I thought it was fun because it's a poster for an instructive play about absinthe. Quite negative, I expect. I haven't seen it, but then I noticed that his glass has another glass contraption on top of it. I can't quite see it. I think it's something where it's perforated on the bottom, and you put like crushed ice in the top, and as that melts, it drips down and dilutes your absinthe. This is like a sort of one-person alternative to an absinthe fountain. Here's something you can buy these now. This one I think is vintage. You put water in the top, and at the bottom is a kind of like a seesaw flat paddle thing, which kind of regulates the drip of water out, like a sort of water clock or one of those things. Bizarre. There's a lot of gimmickry and gadgetry associated with absinthe, a lot of fetishism about it in a way. I think that tells you something quite a lot about it, culturally speaking. But yeah, none of this stuff is very necessary. But you will find, time and time again, the idea that you can do it right or you do it wrong. You read about a neophyte will come in and not quite dilute it right, and the old lag will sweep it away, say, "No, you've ruined it, start again." And apparently there were absinthe professors, old lags, who'd hang around in absinthe bars, itching for a chance to show a neophyte how it's done in the hope that they get a free drink out of it. And even if you're just pouring water into it from a jug, you read about, time to prepare the absinthe to get so-and-so, he's an expert. And I think the idea was to pour it like from very high in a long, thin stream, as if this somehow made it better or something. So yes, there's a lot of voodoo. Now, one thing you shouldn't do with absinthe is set fire to it. The idea of the absinthe fire ritual, there's no history to it. It was invented in the 90s. As absinthe was beginning to make a comeback, some crafty marketers thought to themselves, well, if we're trying to sell absinthe to club kids, we're not going to get them to sit there dreamily while their absinthe prepares to a fountain. So they came up with this. The idea is that you soak a sugar lump in absinthe, and you set fire to it, and you watch as it kind of caramelizes a bit, and then you drop it into the absinthe and stir it where it doesn't dissolve. It sets fire to the absinthe, and then you chuck water in to douse it. Completely made up, potentially dangerous. I don't know where it came from. Some people say it kind of harks back to sort of frat house rituals and things. I often wonder whether it comes from sambuca, which is an Italian liqueur that's traditionally served, but you put a few coffee beans floating on top and set fire to it. And I say that because sambuca is also anise flavoured, so maybe that's where they got the idea from. Now, so I think one of the reasons why many people think that there is fire involved is this scene from the movie From Hell, where Johnny Depp's character prepares a snifter in the bath, and he does it like this. So he has the spoon and the sugar, but he pours the absinthe into the glass over it, spilling half of it down the side, you'll notice. Then he sets fire to the whole thing, although he knows that it blows itself out first of all, and he has to light it again. The addition of of lorddom, it's not traditional, but whatever floats your boat. Then he tips the sugar cube into the absinthe, stirs it a bit where it completely fails to dissolve, as you can see. And then he proceeds to drink it neat. So this is a weird combination of things. Just don't try that at home. No one's ever drunk absinthe that way in real life. But I think it has created a lot of strange myths about absinthe. So that's what it is, and that's how it's drunk. And you think to yourself, well, if there's so much cultishness about it, so much enthusiasm, why did it get banned? A potted history of absinthe. Although wormwood drinks have been drunk for thousands of years, absinthe, as we understand it, goes back to traditionally 1792, when a French aristocrat fleeing the revolution, moves to Switzerland, where this is where a lot of wormwood grows wild, and he started tinkering and allegedly came up with, the guy's name was Pierre Ordinaire, and he invented what we know as absinthe. There's a couple of sisters, the Henriot sisters. Some people say they did it before him, others say he gave them the recipe, whatevs. And then along comes a guy called Captain Dubier, I think his name was. And he liked it so much, he found it was medically efficacious. He had the idea to start manufacturing it. And so he bought the recipe off the sisters. And it went into production. And in 1797, his daughter married a chap called Henri Louis Pernod. And that was the beginning of the Pernod drinks empire. And in its day, Pernod was the biggest manufacturer in the world of absinthe. It's their factory there. But it may well have remained a local delicacy if it weren't for the French colonial wars in North Africa in the 1830s and 40s, I think. The soldiers there were issued with absinthe to ward against malaria and to purify their drinking water. It's still, health tonic. And apparently it worked so well that pretty soon it was issued to French soldiers everywhere. And like a lot of these things, they developed a taste for it. And it's often the case that the soldiers lead fashions, and pretty soon the smart, well-to-do people had developed a taste for absinthe as well. They were the bourgeoisie. And it became fashionable to drink absinthe in what became known as the green hour. Between the end of work at 5 and before you went off to supper, you'd sit in a cafe, drink an absinthe to sharpen your appetite, and then off you go. So far, so good. It was still being regarded as a health drink, drunk by fashionable people. Bear in mind that it was something that they drank for a particular reason at a particular time. They wouldn't have an absinthe session. They'd have one before supper and off they go. But what the fashionable people do tends to trickle down. And it was when the working classes started drinking absinthe that those in power started to worry about it. And absinthe started to become quite popular. It's Degas' famous painting, The Absintheuse. The fact that she's a woman is not accidental. People didn't mind absinthe until it started being drunk widely by the working classes who were supposed to be working, and by women. In fact, some people regarded absinthe as a bit like syphilis. It was something that men picked up and then passed on to their wives. And pretty soon, the French were drinking, huge amounts of absinthe. There you are. And this is right about this time that people started to get alarmed about absinthe and begin to think that maybe it was a blight. Bear in mind that around about this time, there was a growing temperance movement, which in America would ultimately lead to prohibition. So there was that going on as well. But absinthe was very specifically picked on, and they it started to be thought of as something which drove you mad and killed you and bad things like that. Now, there is an element of PR to this. Have a look at this for comparison. Hogarth's famous etching gin lane is 100 years earlier, more, during the gin craze. Laws had been changed. Ale became a bit more expensive. Gin suddenly became cheap, and suddenly the masses switched to drinking gin, which alarmed a lot of people. I'm showing you this because everybody knows Gin Lane. Hogarth's etching where on Gin Lane, when people drink gin, buildings are falling down, everyone's in debt, babies are falling into the gutter. But in fact, it was part of a pair of drawings, the other of which is this one. Beer Street. On Beer Street, everyone's happy and healthy and prosperous because they're drinking a good old ale of England, not this Dutch import. The point being that they weren't just saying don't drink gin, they were saying don't drink gin, drink beer instead. So as much as anything, the instruction not to drink gin was to do with drinking beer, which is healthy. Now, I don't know any evidence that Hogarth was paid for these by the beer industry, but there was definitely a lobby there. And something very similar happened in France 100 years later. This chap here is the Phylloxera vine weevil. and around about the 1870s, 1880s, I think, it devastated the French wine industry because it attacks the roots of the vines, as a result of which wine suddenly became scarcer and more expensive. And this was another of the reasons why there was this huge shift towards drinking absinthe. As wine became more expensive, absinthe became cheaper. Now, absinthe became cheaper partly because the demand was there and less scrupulous producers found industrial ways to manufacture it. And to a certain extent, that might explain some of the negative press that it's had. You had a time when they were just being cobbled together from oils and industrial alcohol to create the flavour, to give it the green colour it was supposed to have. They'd use copper sulfate. To make it loose, they'd use, I think it's antimony trichloride. These are poisonous. So these kind of like knockoff absinthes probably were as bad as people make out absinthe to be. They were giving absinthe a bad name. But it meant the price was lower, a bit like in the gin craze, really crap, cheap gin being sold. At the same time that wine, the traditional French drink, was becoming less available. So this kind of explains a lot of the shift. But the wine industry eventually solved its problem. I think I'm right in saying that they discovered there were some vine species, varieties native to South America, which seemed to be resistant to it. So they imported those, and they took the roots of those and they grafted on their traditional French varieties onto the resistant rootstock to produce a sort of hybrid that was resistant to the weevil, which only attacks the roots. So they solved that problem, and those vines are still being used to produce wine today. So they solved their problems, but then once they'd done that, they realized they were coming back into a market where everyone had switched from wine to absinthe. Now, the French wine industry is quite a powerful lobby. They make wine everywhere in France, but they only make absinthe in that one area on the border between France and Spain, primarily in a place called Pontarlier, which is the home of absinthe. That's where Dubié moved his factory from Switzerland to avoid. And it's at one point it had 25 distilleries in it making absinthe. But it's all focused around there and a place in Switzerland called Cuvée, whereas wine is everywhere. And consequently, the French wine industry had a powerful motive to encourage the belief that absinthe, and absinthe specifically, was bad for you, leading to stuff like this. The peril vert. So with all that sort of lobbying power, things were looking pretty bad for absinthe. And it kind of reached a head in August 1905 in Switzerland, where a man called Jean Lanfray drank 2 glasses of absinthe and promptly shot his wife and 2 daughters, driven to that by absinthe. He did drink 2 glasses of absinthe. He also drank quite a lot of other things. In fact, he drank 2 glasses of absinthe before going to work. Then he had a crème de menthe and a cognac. And then at lunch he had 6 glasses of wine. Back to work he had another glass of wine and a coffee with brandy in it. Then he went home and drank another litre of wine and a coffee with brandy in it. And then he shot his wife and daughters. But people were in no doubt that it was the absinthe that made him do it. Things... in Switzerland, a petition was raised, like 85,000 people signed it. And in due course, the authorities there outlawed absinthe. In France, it was banned in 1915. Tellingly, you can see in the background of this poster, there's a war going on. Obviously, this was in the First World War. And one of the reasons, I think, was that the authorities thought, well, the German troops are just drinking lager. Whereas you have a generation of French youth riddled with absinthe, and you know, are they going to be capable of creating an army? And I think this was the motivation to get it banned, for the health of the troops. In America, it was banned in 1912, and pretty rapidly the rest of Europe as well. But it was never banned here. This is a photograph of a chap called Victor Berlemont in his pub, the York Minster, in 1939 in Soho. That pub went on to become the French House. But my point is, in 1939, he's quite happily preparing absinthe there with his absinthe fountain and his absinthe spoon. And that's how absinthe came to be banned. It was a bit of a scapegoat. Some of the dodgy ones were probably genuinely dangerous. And that was that. It was never banned in Britain. It was never banned in Spain. And I believe that through most of the 20th century, you could go to Spain and find absinthe if you were to look. I think Ernest Hemingway famously did. There was a cocktail called the Death in the Afternoon. It's a mixture of absinthe and champagne. There's no evidence he ever drank it, and it's a bit of a waste of champagne, to be honest. But so it was still around. Another place it was never banned was the Czech Republic, Bohemia in general. And that's where I first encountered it. I guess it must have been in the 90s or something. It's this, Hill's Absinthe. I saw it in a shop and I thought, wow, absinthe. And so I bought some and smuggled it back in. And I had a sort of Gothic dinner party and I presented this as a sort of pièce de résistance. I think most of my guests were hammered by then and weren't much interested. But I had some. And waiting for a trip, hallucinations, nothing happened. Now, Hill's Absinthe was made by a guy called Radamil Hill, and he had a family distilling company going back to the 20s. Times were tough under communism, and after the Velvet Revolution, he was looking for ways to beef things up. So he decided to add absinthe to his roster of products. He said it was an old family recipe, totally authentic. In fact, the reason absinthe was never banned in the Czech Republic was because there'd never been any tradition of drinking it. And in fact, Hill just made the whole thing up. He didn't know what absinthe was supposed to taste like. He said, well, what do I know about it? It's green, and it's got absinthe in it, so it must be bitter. It is both those things. I haven't had it long while. I'm pretty sure it's a bit bitter. It's kind of more borrows from the Central and East European tradition of bitter things like, I think, unicum. And if you've ever had gameldansk, it's it's that kind of tradition. But as we've established, real absinthe isn't actually bitter at all because, it doesn't go through the distillation. But Hill's absinthe caught on, and other absinthe started being produced in the Czech Republic because it was perfectly legal there. And then it came to be imported into this country by this guy here, George Rowley. And it was his marketing guys who came up with a fire ritual. Now, after a while, George realised that Hill had fibbed about it being a traditional thing and that it was all made up. And you'll see that he's standing in front of a bus, not for Hill's Absinthe, because he ditched that and wanted to come up with something more authentic. And he got into bed with this person here, Marie-Claude Delahaye. She has an absinthe museum in somewhere, I can't remember. And she basically persuaded him that his product was all wrong and that absinthe was supposed to be kind of anise flavoured. And with her in premature, he produced a new product called Lafay Absinthe, which, to its credit, it was more like real absinthe than the Czech stuff. It's in the same ballpark. As I say, afterward, as absinthe became more popular, lots of people started, and there were lots of brands now being crept up in America and Germany in particular. They seem to be quite keen on it, and it's one of those things a bit like hi-fi and football, I imagine, where I saw invariably blokes come kind of get very nerdy about it and have very strong opinions about what's correct and authentic and whatever. And George Rowley came in for a lot of stick because they said his absinthe was fake. There's some debate about that. Certainly the colour was fake, and he eventually changed that. And as I say, eventually he reformulated, and his current product, which is the one that I sent out in samples, it's not the greatest, but it's probably a pretty good value. It's about £43 a bottle, which for absinthe is pretty cheap. I mean, 60, 70 is more common. And yeah, now there are lots of absinthe around. So you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, but wasn't it banned? There has been an interesting legal story attached to the revival of absinthe. And it's all to do with this chap. This is thujone. It's the active ingredient in wormwood. And it was considered, as long as science has been applied to absinthe, this has been considered to be the thing that makes it go. When it was banned in America, they specifically banned drinks containing thujone. And for a long time, especially since absinthe was banned, people speculated about chemically what it was about it that made it special, that gave it the qualities which people described that it had, and they put it down to thujone. There was a period in the 70s where they decided that because the thujone molecule looked a little bit like THC, which is the active ingredient in cannabis, that it must have a similar effect on the brain. It doesn't. It's quite different. We now know it's a GABA inhibitor. GABA regulates the functioning of the brain, the firing of the synapses. If you interfere with that, it starts to lose control, leading ultimately to convulsions, tremor, and death. So it's very different from the type of effect that it has on the brain. Now, thujone also occurs naturally in some things like sage and tarragon, I think. So under EU laws, you couldn't really ban thujone completely. But in 1988, an EU directive on the use of flavourings specified that a drink couldn't have more than 10 micrograms per litre of thujone. But what that meant was that a drink that had less than that was legal. And that 1988 ruling effectively cancelled all previous food-related rulings. So basically, somebody realised that the absinthe bans had been cancelled because all those countries were now part of the EU. So we found ourselves in a situation where absinthe with no more than 10 milligrams per litre was actually legal. But that didn't stop people wanting more, because people, you could drink Lafay and you won't get the feelings quite what poets of the past were describing. And people assumed that this was because absinthe before the ban had far more thujone in it. That's why they had to ban it. Have a look at this. This is the Lafay range before he reformulated. So you can see, second from the left, that's his original green one. You can see it's in a clear bottle because the colour's fake. It's not going to go anywhere. Weirdly, he, having mea culpa, realised that Czech absinthe was fake and invented an authentic one. He then brought out his own Czech absinthe as well. That's second from the left, the one that's coloured like Winderline. The ones on the side are interesting. That's his XS range. And that's his high-end range. And they're good stuff. They're made for him by artisan distillers. The green one on the left, is made by François Guy, who has his own brand. The Swiss one is made by Claude-Alain Bugnon, I think, who makes La Clandestine, Angélique, and some others. So they're proper things. But although you can't really tell on this picture, you think that it says absinthe on the front. What it actually says is something like Spirito Ameur avec plante de absinthe. So it's basically a bitter spirit or spirit bitters with absinthe plants in it. The point is, somebody realised that the EU regulations allowed up to 35 milligrams per litre in anything that was bitters. This is like cocktail bitters, something you put a dash in. But people realised that if you call your product bitters, you could put more thujone in it. And that's what happened with these ones. I'm told the distillers didn't want to do it, but George insisted they did because everyone wants more thujone. And then this came along. I'm one of the mugs who... King of Spirits is a Czech absinthe brand. It's Van Gogh on the front. He was quite keen on absinthe. Mind you, also drank turpentine. People have observed that there's a connection between turpentine and chemically between turpentine and wormwood. King of Spirits regular, 10 micrograms per litre. King of Spirits Gold, as you can see there, it's got 100 milligrams. That wasn't legal in the EU, but I managed to buy some online for experts only, you see. Ugh. So I bought this thinking, what the hell? It cost me 100 quid. Poured myself a dose and settled down for my experience. What did I feel? Only regret at having lost £100. It has no effect on you. It tastes very bitter because it's a Czech one. There's weeds floating in the bottom of it. I mentioned it because people were just chasing the thujone. And this may well have continued if it weren't for this chap here. This is Ted Breaux. I mentioned him before. And he's been quite important in what happened next with absinthe. Now, he's a native New Orleans. New Orleans was kind of like the capital of absinthe in America because of its French connections. And he was an environmental scientist. I think he used to test water samples and things like that. And walking around in New Orleans, used to pass this. This is the old Absinthe House. It's a bar. And back in the day, when it sold absinthe, apparently they had these huge stone absinthe fountains built into the bar top. But by the time Ted was there, they'd long gone. It was a regular bar, but it had the same name. And he said, what is this absinthe they speak of? And he started to find out about it. Now, although absinthe was banned in 1912, there was still some of it around. And over the years, bottles of absinthe dating from before the ban will turn up in auctions from house clearances. They'll find dusty bottles in the cellar. And Ted started to build up a collection of these, of actual absinthe, the real stuff as it was from before the ban. And because of what he did for a living, he was able to analyze it using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, like I know how they work. But it basically meant he can work out exactly, molecularly what was in these pre-ban samples of absinthe. And not only that, I mean, he was then able to reverse engineer them, and make kind of recreations of them, which he has done. This is his range, with the exception of the Nouvelle Orleans, which is one he's made up in honor of his hometown. All the others are actual clones of specific absinthes from the era. So, if you want to know what Toulouse-Lautrec and that crowd were actually drinking, you can now. But the most important thing he found out was that absinthe from before the ban, on average, has between 5 and 9 micrograms per litre of thujone. It typically has less thujone than the stuff they're making now. I mean, thujone, for a typical man to get a thujone intoxication apparently takes about 500 milligrams. Basically, you'd have to drink something crazy like 50 bottles of absinthe to get it. And clearly that's not going to happen. The alcohol would kill you first. So what Ted basically established was that whatever the secret of absinthe is, it had nothing to do with thujone. And consequently, the legal situation has kind of gone away because now no one particularly needs to have anything with more thujone in it than that. In America, they didn't get around it. They solved the problem of the ban. I'm told somebody discovered that the original decree banning it was supposed to have been signed by 3 cabinet members, and they only found the signature of 1, so it may never have been legally valid anyway. But the other thing is that the FDA basically tested the products of the distillers who were trying to get it legal. It was clearly harmless. And they basically defined thujone-free as being anything less than 10 micrograms per litre. So everything's fine. It's effectively thujone free and therefore not the thing that was banned anyway. So so there you have it. Absinthe is now back. It's legal. You can drink it exactly as it was, as far as we're aware, before the ban. Which kind of leaves the question: if thujone, thujone is terribly toxic, it's got nothing to do with any effect that absinthe might have on you. Which leaves the question as well: what effect does it have? And there, well, our guinea pigs at home, I hope that as we're doing this right now, we'll be establishing whether the absinthe has had any effect on them. This is the popular image of the green fairy inspiring the poet. I should say at this stage that I personally have never experienced anything from absinthe that I would really feel was different from that you might get from alcohol in general. But there are those who do. I'm going to read you something that Oscar Wilde famously said about absinthe. He said, "After the first glass, you see things as you wish they were. After the second, you see things as they are not. Finally, you see things as they really are. And that is the most horrible thing in the world. Take a top hat. You think you see it as it really is, but you don't because you've associated with other things and ideas. If you'd never heard of one before and suddenly saw it alone, you'd be frightened or laugh. That is the effect that absinthe has, and that is why it drives men mad." Oscar said that. And another person who wrote about absinthe is this chap here, Aleister Crowley. And he wrote, "A single glass seems to render the breathing freer, the spirit lighter, the heart more ardent, soul and mind alike more capable of executing the great task of doing that particular work in the world which the Father may have sent them to perform." So, like Oscar, he clearly feels there is something special about the way absinthe makes you feel and inspires you. But he also wrote this: "What is there in absinthe that makes it a separate cult? The effects of its abuse are totally distinct from those of other stimulants. Even in ruin and in degradation, it remains a thing apart. Its victims wear a ghastly aureole all of their own, and in their particular hell, yet gloat with a sinister perversion of pride that they are not as other men." So it's quite interesting that both Oscar and Crowley feel that there is something particular about absinthe, there's something inspiring, but it's also something terrifying. Now, you could argue that that's a pretty good description of the relationship that any self-aware alcoholic has with alcohol, and indeed many writers have. But certainly they feel that there is something special there, and there are I know other people who do. For example, it's our own David Smith there on the right. He told me that he definitely feels that he has experienced something from absinthe which is different from just drinking alcohol. And there's Ted Brough again. Now, he admits that as an absinthe distiller, he's kind of got a vested interest in maintaining the mystique of absinthe. But he said he does think that there is something there. His feeling is that there is something in amongst all those herbs, or the combination of them, which has a sort of stimulant effect. So that in combination with the alcohol, which kind of relaxes you, perhaps opens the mind, at the same time, these other herbs focus the mind and create what he calls a lucid intoxication. You would have seen earlier on one of his brands, which he made for America, is called Lucid, and that's the reason. A lucid intoxication, he thinks, is how he sums up the effect that absinthe has. Our guinea pigs will be able to say if they have a feeling that themselves. But as a warning to those of you who are trying to seek the help of the green fairy to create your art, I'm going to leave you with a poem by Edmund Bourgeois, mid-century, fairly little-known poet. And he wrote, "Anxious and grieving, in the smoky enclosure of a cafe I dream, and dreaming I write, of the blue tints of the sun that I love, when I see its light in a glass of absinthe. Then the mind scales the highest peaks, and the heart is full of hope and the scent of hyacinth. I write and write, saying, absinthe is holy, and the green-eyed muse is forever sovereign. But alas, a poet is just a man. With the first glass drunk, for better writing, I wanted a second, and the writing slowed. The tumultuous waves of thought dried up, and deserted, my brain became hollow. It needed only one glass, and I drank two. There's a warning for you all. So, that's enough from me. I hope that Ali's sitting here monitoring things. I can't see the chat myself. I gather there's some hot stuff being posted here.
Yes,
The absinthe is flowing.
Tony Reid is reporting heightened emotions.
Splendid.
Various people are dallying with the death of the afternoon against your specific instructions.
Well, whatever. Can't blame me.
We've got a few specific questions.
Yes,
Which I'll be waiting till the end, so I don't want to interrupt you.
very wise.
And the first one is Ruth Blanco asked whether with the preparation of absinthe you could use sugar syrup.
If you want to sweeten it, then yes, you can. That's a good way of getting around the problem of making a sugar dissolve. And that's why a lot of cocktails will almost invariably use sugar syrup rather than lump sugar, just because when you're dealing with a very cold liquid, it's an easier way of doing it. So yeah, definitely. Any other questions?
I'm just saying there's a lot of creative activity going on. I think Ed Marlowe has produced a zombie story.
Good.
Since taking his absinthe. Rachel and Paul have been following your lushing preparation instructions
Good.
very carefully, and so is Francis, I think. Rachel says she's going to put details of the Zoom meeting on the Facebook event page for
Good.
afters.
Good,
I'm just
good,
gonna have a look through if there's any other questions. Luigi, about using flames. Luigi says that in Italy we put fire on some traditional drinks in the Valle d'Aosta region.
Right.
Lots of people remember fondly or otherwise, I'm not quite sure, drinking Hill's absinthe in the 90s.
Well, if you enjoyed it, good luck to you. I thought it was horrible.
In the Johnny Depp clip, Darcy thinks that was crack laudanum. David Smith has a question. Would the absinthe, the original absinthe, I think he means, would be made of non-grape based spirit?
Now, some people feel that it is, that it would have been. And I know that Ted Bro uses grape spirit. In fact, his grape spirit is so exquisite. He now sells it bottled on its own. It's quite nice. We don't really know. I mean, it's one of those things whereby if you were making it and there was lots of grapes around, maybe you would. But one thing you can definitely say is that once phylloxera struck, the absinthe being made then would definitely not have been made with grape spirit because there wasn't any. It was being too expensive. So I think certainly during that period, it was not have been made with grape spirit. Before that, who knows? Anything else?
Adrian says, I'm drinking Hills at the moment. Maybe I like the bitter taste.
Well, this is an interesting thing because one of the reasons people thought that pre-ban absinthe had more thujain or something in it was they assumed it must be more bitter because people were adding sugar to it. We now know that isn't the case. It's just a question of taste. It's possible that I've heard that people back then in the olden days might have just had a sweeter tooth. Having said that, I don't know how old Campari is, so maybe not. But yeah, some people like a bitter taste. I'm a fan of Campari, actually. I like bitter things. But and I've never found an absinthe, not a real absinthe anyway, which I thought needed any sugar at all.
Okay, well, there's a lot of other discussion of horrible mixes to have with absinthe. But I think that's it. Everyone says, well, we have a pizza. Bravo, excellent talk.
Thank you very much. Perhaps.
Oh, I'm not sure whether you want to. Yes, how we're going to judge the artistic efforts.
Well, it's not really for me to judge. I think it's for everyone looking at them to decide for themselves if they think. I'll publish everything in the next newsletter as well. But really, I think you can decide for yourself, and perhaps our guinea pigs themselves can decide whether they felt more inspired whilst sozzled with absinthe. As I say, I'm sceptical about there being anything special about it, but there are plenty of people who feel that there is. So maybe I'm just not susceptible. But yeah, judge for yourself. And if you like the idea, do go out and try Absinthe. By all means, try check Absinthe if you want to. But do try some proper Absinthe. Ted's stuff is great. It's not cheap. I think it's a good 70 quid a bottle or something. But if you want to know what they were drinking before the ban, it's a good way to find out. Okay, so maybe we can go over to Zoom, and I'll wind up this talk for now. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope